Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. Today we are going to talk about the collapsing ruble, of course, but we are going to talk about much more than that. The duress on Russia's economy, sanctions, secondary sanctions, and a variety of other issues as well. If you like the materials we create, please make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of the fantastic guests who share their time and expertise with the audience. Thank you as well to everyone who has bought me a coffee or become a patron. It's incredibly important to help the work of the channel continue. And to those who have been generous enough to support our film documentary project, thank you so much for that. We are almost at the first target to start filming on the ground, which is fantastic news. And we will, of course, be sharing more details of that in the community pages of the channel. Today, to unpack the apparent collapse in the Russian economy, or the first signs of it, I'm going to be talking to Timothy Ash. He's been a professional economist for more than 30 years, with two-thirds of that in the banking industry. Timothy's specialism is emerging European markets, and he writes and blogs extensively on the economic challenges for leading publications such as the Kyiv Post, Atlantic Council, Financial Times, and United Business Journal. He's an associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House and has advised various governments on Ukraine-Russia policy and specifically on the impact of the sanctions. Welcome back to the channel again.
My pleasure.
Well, these videos always go down very well, and we always seem to speak at, I would say, critical or pivotal moments in the changes of the war, especially as they pertain to the economy. What I have been accused of, and many people in the space have been accused of, is crying wolf, saying, look, the Russian economy, it's about to collapse, it's about to collapse. And here we are, 3 years in almost, and it has stubbornly refused to collapse. Why is that, and why should this time be any different?
Well, as I've said probably previously, the one person who knew the invasion was going to happen was Vladimir Putin. He prepared for this. It was certainly an option for him as far back as the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And he built resources and reserves and buffers because of that, right? So in the run-up to the full-scale invasion, Russian foreign exchange reserves were about $600 billion. Russia deleveraged, reduced debt, reduced vulnerabilities. It was running current account surpluses and fiscal surpluses. So they were well prepared. And at the same time, Western sanctions ultimately have proven to be too soft, right, up until this point in time. I mean, I describe it as sanctions by the highest common denominator, right? I mean, always trying to ensure coalition unity. I get that. I get why it was done, to show kind of political solidarity and unity. But the reality it was that it meant that there was always an excuse not to do, what was needed, right? There was always a country or a company that wanted an exception, a carve out. Rolling sanctions out was excruciatingly slow. It enabled Russia to think of ways to get around sanctions. I think enforcement has been too weak. The BBC ran an article this week. I participated in that. It's incredible that no one goes to jail for sanctions breaking, right? Particularly in the UK, right? There are no consequences by helping Russia get around sanctions, even when there are cast iron cases. So there's a huge incentive, financial incentive for people to help Russia get around sanctions, and there are no consequences. People don't go to jail. There are no financial penalties. So there's been a whole industry around sanctions busting, helping Russia get around these sanctions. So lots of different reasons. Russia had buffers. Sanctions have been too weak in reality. We haven't done enough to counter sanctions busters, etc. Just all very disappointing, really, in terms of the Western response. I mean, you could extend that more generally to military support for Ukraine, right? It's drip fed. It's often too little, too late. Lack of joined up thinking, lack of Western leadership, lack of understanding what the threat is. I would argue, and I have argued, Russia is an existential threat to Western liberal market democracy. We need to wake up. Politicians get on a train to Kiev, have a nice photo op, say the right kind of things, but then come back home and kind of forget about it, right? So we could have done a lot more, but there is some evidence now that the durability in the Russian economy against sanctions is beginning to wear down, and the West is perhaps waking up a bit to the fact that it actually can make a difference in terms of the Russian economy if it wants to do that.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Because we are almost 3 years into the largest war on the territory of Europe, something which is in certain respects comparable to, aspects of the Eastern Front in the Second World War. And yet 3 years in, it seems that every month new sanctions are announced, new measures are taken, and it raises the question, well, why on earth are so many loopholes, so many gaps, so many levers not being pulled that there is still the capacity to carry on doing this? And linked to that, it seems that there are two things that have had a seismic shock on accelerating difficulty in the Russian economy. One is the tightening of secondary sanctions, which has caused the Chinese to start drawing back from their provision of sort of credit, sort of private and governmental to Russia, which happened earlier in the year. And now the tightening of sanctions on Gazprom Bank. It seems that we had these levers that we could pull at all times. And am I cynical in thinking that this isn't just a matter of people just waking up and saying, oh, we could do this? Governments, especially Washington, must have known that these levers could have been pulled at any time, and they must have had a reasonably good idea of what the impact would have been. So this is a strategic choice, not just ineptness or bureaucratic inertia.
Well, I mean, lots of things to think about in that. Firstly, I'd say the West has misread Putin systematically, I would argue, over the last 20 years. It's shown an abundance of caution. And even when, I guess, since the full-scale invasion, we've actually learned that, we can have escalation dominance over Putin. Putin does set red lines, doesn't necessarily keep to them. He is scared. I think what we've learned, he's scared of a full-scale war with NATO and the Western Alliance. He knows he wouldn't win that. We've had a lot more cards. Our cards were better than I think many of our leaders thought they were, right? And I think, now maybe the realization is dawning that, we're reaching a crunch point, and unless we deploy our full hand, Ukraine might lose, right? I mean, it's a pretty desperate situation that, in the dregs of the Biden presidency, they're finally up in the ante and doing things that they should have done months ago. Obviously, particularly the provision of long range. Well, the green light for Ukraine to use long range missiles further into Russia. Why wasn't that done ages ago? Putin threatens, or Medvedev threatened, use of weapons of mass destruction in response. He hasn't really done that. He didn't even go to an ICBM. He went for an intermediate range. I mean, it showed again, kind of Putin blinked on that one. And on the various sanctions measures you mentioned, I mean, notable was the sanctioning of MOEX, the Russian FX exchange, over the summer. A lot of Russian trade is the FX part of it is transacted over that exchange, or was. Many Chinese entities use that to transact all trade, not just energy. And closing it down, interestingly, Chinese entities weren't particularly willing to find alternatives. So that's been, I think, pretty seismic in terms of its impact. Russia can still send goods offshore, but it's been difficult. It's found it difficult to get the dollars back, and obviously it needs the dollars to sustain the war, to support the currency. Obviously, that's been a focus for this week. Gazprom Bank as well. I mean, it is pretty remarkable if you think of the excuses used by energy industry lobbyists, European politicians, particularly in Germany, in Hungary, in Austria, in Slovakia, that said, you can't sanction Gazprom Bank because it will see a huge impact on global markets. Well, it's been sanctioned. There hasn't been almost any impact on international markets, but it has impacted Russia. So, again, this idea of an overabundance of caution, inability to read Putin adequately. I think also on the sanctions issue in the end, look, sanctions are just one of many tools used these days for countries that essentially don't want to go to war. Right? I mean, what else could the West done aside from go to war in response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine? Sanctions were one of the easier levers to reach for, but they're an imprecise tool. They're complicated, they're complex, lots of moving parts. You need to work with lots of allies, lots of third-party countries. There are risks of impact on, unintended consequences, impact on other global markets, etc. You need to think a lot about them, and countries figure out to get round sanctions. That they are pretty complicated. But I think it's important. I think in the end, and there's a desire, I think, to hurt the target of sanctions more than yourself. But sanctions are not cost-free, right? I mean, for them to be effective, you have to be also willing to take a hit yourself, right? It can damage businesses in the West as you roll them out, right? I think that one of the problems is our governments have wanted our support for Ukraine to be cost-free. They haven't been willing to bear the burden of this incredibly important battle by Ukraine fought in our favor, right? Or, in our defense, right? So if you want the war, if you want Ukraine to win the war, there is a cost, right? But the reality is, bearing some short-term cost of supporting Ukraine will ensure much lower long-term costs. I mean, a classic one is defense spending. I've put a lot of focus on it, what it's been costing to help Ukraine sustain the war. It's about $100 billion a year. I'd argue that to win the war, we should have been giving Ukraine $150 billion. But what happens if Ukraine loses? What are the costs to the West of a Ukrainian defeat? It is a massive increase in European defense spending, 1-2 percentage points of GDP. That is multiples of the 100 to 150 billion one-off cost, arguably, of supporting Ukraine in the war. Remember, if we lose this war, we'll be spending 1-2% of GDP more on defense in Europe perennially over many years, right? So, it's just a lack of leadership, lack of strategic long-term thinking, lack of inability to really understand the threats, and a lack of willingness to really pay a short-term price, right? I mean, that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but that's where we are.
And of course, if you look at the US spending on defense, it's, I believe, around 2 billion a day. If you're going to take the combined defense spending of countries within the sort of what's called the Western Alliance, then it's going to at least double, treble that. I would imagine. I don't have those figures in front of me. When we put Ukrainian support in that context, it looks more like a rounding error rather than the sort of huge amount of money which is often sort of spun in the media without context being provided.
Well, yes. I mean, unfortunately, Trump has been correct in the fact that Europe has been free riding for too long on the US defense backstop. And you mentioned US defense spending, it's about $800 billion. Unfortunately, the combined European defense spend is a fraction of that, right? It's probably, between $300 and $400 billion. It is going to have to increase very significantly because of what we've seen in the last, the 1,000 days and the decade before in terms of Russian aggression. But as you also highlighted, if the 100 billion annual support for Ukraine, of that total, about $60 billion is defense spending, right? And of that, in terms of the US component of it, it's probably 40 billion. So if you think of that, it's roughly a 40 billion annual spend from the US in supporting Ukraine in terms of its defense, of an $800 billion combined military budget. I mean, you can do the maths, 5% of overall US defense spending to push back a major global rival, right? I've obviously written quite a lot on the subject, but in terms, again, cost benefit, if you think of 5% of US defense spending for the Ukrainians to erode probably half of Russia's conventional military capability. It's incredible bang for buck, and notable is most of that US defense spend on Ukraine stays in the US, right? It's US kit made in US states and US towns, many in red constituencies, right? I mean, very little of that money actually is paid direct to Ukraine, right? You know, I mean, no US boots on the ground, no US casualties. It's an incredible win for the Americans, right? That the Ukrainians have fought so valiantly in defense of Western liberal market democracy. And, the US has been a huge beneficiary of it through increased defense sales, right? So I know Trump and J.D. Vance, etc., have been fairly critical of this support, but I mean, there's lots of debate about where we go from here. But if Ukraine survives, it's going to be a big market for US defense companies, right? It will continue to need to fund its own defense. Europe will need to fund its defense and Ukraine's defense. They will be buying a lot of kit from the Americans, right? Is the US going to say no to that? I don't think so, right? I would think European and Ukrainian defense demand from US military industrial complex is going to run to hundreds of billions of dollars a year, right? So they may well want the war to end, and there may be some people in the Trump administration that rather like Putin, but are they going to say no to those huge defense sales from Europe? I don't think so.
And of course, I mean, this isn't so much a question, but this sounds like the greatest deal in history. And of course, when you run the numbers as you have done on your Substack to great effect, I think that is borne out. Interesting that Trump would not recognize, a great deal if it came and slapped him in the face. But that is another issue aside. What I find interesting as well is this abundance of caution that you mentioned, because the reason for it is often touted as the sort of nuclear fear, the fear of Russian collapse, the fear of nuclear chaos, the fear of Putin escalating because, he's clearly insane, he's a psychopath, etc. But at the same time, we expect to be able to negotiate with him as a rational actor. There's something that doesn't quite sort of add up in that logic. Is it possible that that is something which an administration like the Biden one would feel sort of comfortable putting out there in the public domain? They wouldn't feel quite so comfortable saying our overabundance of caution is to keep, let's say, global energy prices low. That clearly is a consideration, but it sounds so much more mercenary if you're going to frame it in those terms politically.
Yeah. Well, look, Putin is a rational actor, right? I mean, and a number of other people argued the invasion was going to happen. It was entirely logical, I think, for Putin to invade. If you go back to February 22, he saw weakness in the West. He saw a window of opportunity in Ukraine. Again, he saw military weakness in Ukraine. Europe was kind of on the hook in terms of the energy story. There was vulnerability there. Ukraine obviously was moving forward in terms of Euro integration. And I guess the intelligence he was getting, right? I mean, the intelligence he was getting was that he could win the war very quickly. And in fact, the same intelligence, the Americans came to the same conclusion: the war would be over in 2 weeks. So what he did was entirely logical, right? Fortunately, the intelligence that he had and the Americans had was wrong. Ukraine did fight, had great capability. And in the end, the West did come through with significant support, which has helped the Ukrainians sustain the war for 1,000 days. Unfortunately, it's not been enough. We should have done more. We should have recognized that this was an opportunity to beat Putin. There's been obviously chances in the last 1,000 days when the momentum has been on Ukraine's side, right? So, I think when it comes to the threat, I think he's a rational, logical character. He seems to value his own life far more than other people. I think he understands kind of the Cold War calculation in terms of the nuclear deterrent. It's not that easy to use or deploy, right? I mean, he's had opportunities, you could argue, in the mid or the early part of the war. Remember, around the Azov steel plant, there was concerns around that time about use of tactical battlefield nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction to give Russia battlefield advantage. He opted not to use them, right? He opted not to use them for very good reason. That firstly, they wouldn't necessarily be that successful. Using those kind of missiles in Europe. I mean, look at Chernobyl. It has much broader consequences, and the risks are obviously of contamination of a much broader area, as we know from Chernobyl. Also, I think it would lose Putin the global narrative, right? I mean, in terms of the global South, I think would have problems with that. China, in particular, I think the Chinese made it absolutely crystal clear to Putin that nuclear escalation has to be taken off the table because it would absolutely rock global markets. China's in for the long game in terms of hegemony with the Americans. They want global stability, right? They don't want something that is going to crash. It's going to boost energy prices and commodity prices and crash broader global markets at the time when the Chinese economy is in such a difficulty. So I think they read the riot act to Putin. And in the end, it's guaranteed mutual self-destruction, right? Or destruction once he uses them, right? So I think he's bluffing. He won't use them. And we are seeing escalation, clearly. We're seeing conventional escalation at the moment in the run-up to very likely negotiations, right? We've seen Russia obviously push on in Donbass, obviously the North Korean troops in Kursk. We've seen the West also. I mean, you could argue Biden's decision to greenlight long-range weapons use in Kursk and elsewhere in Russia, and then the various sanctions I've mentioned, Gazprom Bank, and also sanctions we've seen on the shadow fleet. All this is about heaping the pressure on Russia from the West and Ukraine into those negotiations, giving Ukraine more leverage in negotiations. And Putin himself, obviously, we've seen, if you think back to the Minsk I, Minsk II negotiation process, Putin always escalates before negotiations, always. It's his modus operandi. It's worked for him in the past, but it's incomprehensible to me to imagine a scenario where Putin resorts at this stage to weapons of mass destruction, or even ever, because it's mutual self-destruction. I think in the context of potential negotiations between Trump and Putin, I think it would make it also very difficult for Trump to sit down with Putin, if he'd use weapons of mass destruction first use, right? I mean, you could almost say goodbye to those negotiations.
And of course, some of the military experts who've come onto the channel have said that any use of tactical nuclear weapons actually wouldn't change the calculus on the ground at all. It wouldn't provide any clear advantage to Russian troops. There's something else I wanted to dig into, and it's interesting. So you say Russian system needs dollars, but actually a lot of the trades as part of the sort of grey economy serviced by the grey fleet actually result in Russia being paid, I believe, in yuan and rupees. How much of a problem is this? Especially given that we focused on the currency rate, exchange rate between the dollar and the euro and the ruble, and those trades have now been frozen until next year. But if you look at the ruble exchange rate with the yuan and the rupee, they are also crashing in the same way, if not in an even more alarming fashion. How keen will those countries be to carry on trading Russian hydrocarbons for a currency that now looks like it is artificially sort of frozen? And the real exchange rate, if it was allowed to sort of free fall, would show a significantly devalued currency.
Look, those countries still need Russian commodities. The global economy arguably still needs those commodities, right? I mean, if we see a lasting peace in the Middle East, obviously we've got the we've got the Hezbollah-Israel ceasefire deal this week. The Trump presidency is talking about pumping more oil. That will certainly help fill gaps, if Russia is somewhat restrained in terms of exports. But, the reality is, markets still need those commodities, right? It's difficult to replace the scale of Russian commodity exports. But all these sanctions, I mean, effectively what they do is they increase costs to Russia of international trade, right? In the end, by making it really difficult to transact the currency to make those physical commodity exports work, and increasing the difficulties of paying for imports. You reduce the revenue stream from each dollar of oil or ton of metals to Russia, and you increase the price of Russia, what it needs to pay for its various imports, right? The net result is less dollars available to Russia to fund the war. I think what we've seen in the last couple of weeks or month or so in terms of downside pressure on the ruble, is a reflection of a shortage of dollars and hard currency, right? An erosion over time of Russian buffers. They've got less reserves, obviously. The West G7 has immobilized 330 billion of CBR assets, so they had less FX reserves in any event. But the Russians have been forced to let the currency weaken as a natural response to a shortage of dollars, right? And to kind of help to rebalance its trade and current account positions, right? Now, countries don't like weaker currencies, typically. I mean, they may say, well, it's going to make our exports more competitive. Well, kind of in the short term, yes. There are consequences. The consequences are inflation. Russia already has an inflation problem because it's running a very tight war economy. There's a shortage of resources in the country, particularly labor now. It means high inflation. What happens as a result of that? The central bank has to increase interest rates. They're already at very high levels at 21%. Probably they're going to have to go to 30, 40, 50%, something like that to defend the ruble. That means lower growth, right? So, all overall, it just sends a message of, tightening, more difficult economic conditions around Russia. There's been a narrative in the media, obviously pushed out by pro-Russian operatives, that the Russian economy is doing really well, it's growing, etc. Well, it's survived. It hasn't crashed as many people expected because of these buffers that I've mentioned. Its ability to continue to trade energy and commodities, get dollars for those. But over time, things are getting more difficult, right? And the pressure on the exchange rate suggests that Putin now is going to have to make much more difficult choices. It's not going to get easier. It's going to get harder the longer the war goes on, which is why the Biden administration and its G7 allies have tightened sanctions around Russia in recent weeks, because it wants a more difficult economic outlook to be really important in terms of Putin's decision set as he makes the decision whether to sit down in negotiations or continue the war, right? I think the message from the West should be, if Putin decides to continue the war, sanctions will remain in place. They will get tougher. Russia's economic position will get more difficult. So lower growth, higher inflation, weaker currency, more capital outflows, more shortages in the economy, all those kind of things. And that, for Putin, will risk social and political instability. And I think he doesn't like those things. So this idea that Putin can fight the long war, I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. He can fight the long war, but a longer war comes with greater risks to him personally, right? And also, I guess, the decision of the Biden team to step up arms facilitation or provision to the Ukrainians with the long-range capabilities, etc. That's all part of that process. What we're seeing is the West increase pressure on Putin to come to the negotiating table under a Trump presidency. Actually, whoever won the US elections, I think there would have been negotiations, whether it was Harris or Trump. Both sides can fight the long war. I don't think both sides really want that. There is an opportunity at the moment for a negotiated settlement.
We'll come to that in a minute, because this is interesting. Putin's dynamic, Trump's dynamic, do not seem to exactly align in this respect, or at least Putin's demands potentially are not going to be fulfillable by the Ukrainian side. But we'll come to that in a minute, because you hint here at something that I think is quite interesting, and this is the sort of almost verging on a Soviet era falsification of key economic statistics. So the publicly announced inflation rate is getting towards 8.5%, which is already double the central bank target, the Russian central bank target. But if you look at something like, well, not just the collapsing ruble, trades of which are now being frozen, but if you look at something called the Bourse index, plus other key economic indicators, it looks far more likely that inflation is somewhere in the region of 20 to 30%. And key staples like potatoes have actually gone up, I think, sort of 63% year on year, which is an extraordinary kind of rate. So are we seeing massive falsification of economic data? And what's the impact there? Even Russia's allies and those that are willing to carry on trading with it, from an amoral sort of standpoint, are they going to look at that and be somewhat put off dealing with Russia if it's lying about its economic data on this industrial scale?
Well, I mean, it might well be falsifying the data. I mean, when it comes to inflation, I mean, globally, I think generally populations don't believe official data, right? I mean, I'm sure if you live in the UK, you live in the States or Turkey, wherever, there's a lot of skepticism about actual inflation data. So I think Russia is probably suffering the same problem that the people on the street, really feel you see inflation, right? And maybe some of the inflation indices need to be adjusted post COVID and post the inflation surge we've seen, etc. So, but bottom line is, a weaker currency, there's going to be more inflation, without a doubt. I mean, currency devaluations, it inevitably leads to an exchange rate pass-through because countries import stuff and devaluations make those imports more expensive. It's just the way it is, right? So inflation is heading higher. That will, I think, undermine support for the regime. If you look at opinion polls, interestingly, support for the war seems to be ebbing a bit. People now seem to want negotiations, and I think Putin will have to reflect that, right? I mean, I think it's interesting that, again, this idea that Putin can play the long war, etc. I mean, taking I think 12,000 North Korean troops to fight in Kursk is a remarkable development. For a country that's, the message has been it's a huge country, it's got huge labor resources, they can mobilize more soldiers. I mean, that shows actually that Putin is very mindful of social pressures, right? The fact that he's been willing to take foreign troops on Russian soil to defend Russian territory, I think shows the sensitivities, right? So higher inflation, a weaker currency, increasing casualties on the front line. These are all going to weigh on the social setting in Russia. And again, it's a risk. It's a risk to Putin. I mean, 18 months ago, remember the Prigozhin-Wagner mutiny? I mean, no one expected that, right? I think zero people expected that Wagner troops could be a couple of hours away from Moscow, right? I mean, it's just extraordinary to think that the regime was on its back foot. It's subsequently recovered. But I think, what you should read from that is this regime is actually not that secure. You can't rule out the unexpected. And I think increasing casualties on the front line, a weakening economic outlook because of prolonged sanctions, tighter sanctions, higher inflation, all those kind of things. I mean, they increase the risks for Putin, right? I mean, it's not inevitable that we see a social and political revolution in the country, right? It's probably not my base case, but the risks of it increase. And Putin, I think, will be mindful of that. So again, it's another factor that will encourage Putin to sit down and negotiate.
Or even just not even a coordinated sort of social explosion, but just simply the sight of people queuing outside banks to withdraw their savings, this kind of stuff. I mean, some sort of non-organized view that collapse is taking place could be interesting. And of course, this is interesting, isn't it? Because the ruble is now crashed through what was seen to be a psychological barrier of 100 rubles to the dollar. And if it goes further and goes down to a level lower than the initial instability we saw in the currency in 2022, that I think would be quite an interesting point, wouldn't it? Although the trades are now sort of frozen, But this isn't unique. The currency trading was frozen back in 2022 when the initial financial shock to the Russian system of what essentially seems to have been a decision to go to full-scale war made by a tiny handful of people. Which took a lot in the government administration by surprise, apparently. But it seems that first time around, freezing the currency actually worked because by the time they unfroze currency trades, they'd put in place all sorts of mechanisms, as you say, to start creating this sort of grey economy, grey fleet, and all the rest of it. And the ruble recovered. We're seeing that same tactic now. But actually, do you think that because the things have dramatically sort of changed compared to 2022 and not in Putin's favor, that actually freezing currency trades may build up sort of pent up anxiety and huge downward pressure. They may well be doing this waiting for Trump to come in, but do you think it's going to work this time, or are we going to see an accelerated collapse of the ruble if they unfreeze, the trading?
Well, they have a lot of tools in their arsenal, right? They can increase interest rates, as you mentioned. They can impose capital controls. None of them are particularly good options, right? I mean, a weak currency is a reflection of, in the end, ultimately a shortage of foreign currency. I mean, that's the reality, right? The currency markets are, it's demand and supply, and clearly there's a shortage. That's why there's pressure on the ruble. But the things you do to kind of alleviate those problems, they're not cost and pain free, right? I mean, they probably can stabilize the currency at a weaker level. They would argue, that gives them a competitiveness boost. It certainly helps the budget revenue position. They sell oils in dollars, they convert them to rubles. That will help rebalance the budget and help fund the war a bit. But as I said, there are consequences of this, right? Capital controls make it harder for everyone to get dollars. It makes trade more difficult. It likely means less economic activity and higher interest rates. Again, there will be another factor to weigh on economic activity. It's not the optimal picture that you want, right? I mean, having these periodic devaluations, it creates expectations of more devaluation. As you said, I mean, these points of deflection turning points in terms of currency are points of vulnerability and anxiety. In a population that's already 1,000 days into a war, suffering human casualties, people will be nervous and worried about this, right? I mean, it sends a picture actually of the war's actually not going that well. Putin's management of Russia is kind of not working as well as the propaganda, the Kremlin propaganda machine have been implying. If things were going great, the ruble will be strengthening. Inflation will be low. The economy will be growing great guns. Everything will be wonderful. And that's just not the reality, right?
And of course, Russian central bankers, especially Elvira Nabiullina, have been perhaps a little more competent than we expected going into this. And they've managed to keep a certain sort of handle on the economy, on inflation until now. And of course, this sort of shadow economy is being created, which has been rather cunning and to an extent rather effective. But we now see key figures such as the oligarch who has majority stake in Rosteck, starting to sort of bump heads with Nabiullina and the so-called liberal, not liberal politically, but perhaps liberal in terms of their economics, people who've been in charge. Are we going to start seeing these sort of internal conflicts that start to weed out the remaining experts in the system who have actually helped keep this sort of this horrible Putin war machine going and enough liquidity in the system to prevent it from collapsing to now? Is this maybe one of the fault lines we're going to start seeing open up?
Well, you're right. I mean, one thing about Putin is on the economics front, he hired technocrats, capable people in the central bank and Ministry of Finance, and they've rolled out fairly orthodox responses to the challenges they face. That's helped in terms of durability. But those complaints from oligarchs, etc., is a reflection of, a long war. Ultimately, the buffers have been eroded with inflation, and an attempt to manage the currency too strong has meant competitiveness problems ultimately. labor shortages, foreign exchange shortages. Doing business is just becoming more difficult. I mean, sanctions mean no one wants to invest in Russia, right? Which international entity would want to put real investment? And ultimately, that means long-term Russian decline, right? I mean, whatever happens in this war, if people are not willing to put long-term money in Russia, either because of sanctions or because they just don't like the economic outlook, that's got to mean a much worse kind of economic outlook. And, a lot of the oligarchs and these they're not stupid, right? I mean, I guess they can see what's going on, and it's not a great kind of mix, right? The outlook is pretty poor. So you would hope that within the elites in Russia, someone steps up and helps us all out.
And I have some regular chats with a Rush chap who used to work in the energy sector, and I think that's quite instructive. And often we will try to focus it on key economic stats which don't make the headlines. And well, obviously the currency is the big story at the moment, and that's what the media focuses on. But you have this sort of shadow inflation, the Bosch index, which I think is an interesting stat to look at. The other one, which is my favorite at the moment, is the incredible rise of the rates people are paying for their mortgages. So mortgage rate is skyrocketing, which is going to make it um, unaffordable for millions of families to keep, or those who are the proto middle class, to actually keep things going. That to me is a really interesting indicator because it means that the war is starting to bite into people's personal finances. Those who are in massive debt are being encouraged to sign contracts with the military. This is something that doesn't get a huge amount of attention. So yes, Putin's tried to protect the urban populations of Moscow, St. Petersburg, Ekaterinburg, and others, but it seems that some of the costs of the war are really going to start biting. Is that an interesting stat to you? And are there any other stats that you think we should be looking at which don't really get much attention?
Well, I guess you look in the end, a long war, uh, increased Western sanctions, evidence of stress in terms of the Russian economy, inflation, exchange rate, as you mentioned, mortgage rates higher, and they're going to be going even higher because of what the central bank will need to do to defend the currency. It all adds up to a more difficult picture locally, right? And again, it adds to Putin's decision set in terms of where he goes from here, right? He can continue the war, yes, for a long time, but it's just more risks for him.
And we're getting extraordinary mixed signals, I think, from China. On the one hand, it's limiting credit facilities, both sort of private, but also to industries and at state level as well, under potentially pressure of secondary sanctions and maybe other factors as well. But at the same time, you have evidence that is being discussed by intelligence experts that there is significant transfer, not just of components, dual use components from China to Russia, but actual direct military exports as well. And as was shown, I think, earlier in the week or last week, you have a Chinese fishing vessel dragging its anchor through the Baltic Sea, severing cables. So potentially China. It's almost inconceivable that the Chinese government wouldn't have awareness of that or would allow Chinese vessels and crews to be used in that capacity. So they have some complicity in the what seems to me a really growing trend of grey zone or hybridized warfare. What game is China playing here? Because it's clearly not neutral. Even though you said earlier it doesn't want a global war, because that only does it doesn't want a nuclear war, but it certainly seems willing to push all sorts of buttons to test and maybe even degrade the strength of the Western allies.
Yes, I mean the China one is quite interesting. I mean, you mentioned the ship that pulled its anchor in the Germany sort of Scandi cable story. It turns out the captain was Russian. Now, so I'm not sure who's really behind that. The Chinese look like they're cooperating, so maybe they didn't know anything about it. I think in the end, China, I think, has pursued a sort of delicate line. I think the war, the most important relation, I mean, Russia and China had that partnership without limits, right? That was signed just before the Beijing Olympics, just before the invasion. And I think when the war happened, most people thought that China knew about it, that it maybe would go into Taiwan. It's part of some joint operation, and that Putin had the support of China. I don't think that's the reality, right? I think the Chinese have been very nervous about the war, and what we've learned is the number one relationship for China is not with Russia, it's with the Americans, right? And actually, they could have done a lot more to support Russia in the war, and they've held back. I mean, they've done enough to make sure Russia doesn't lose, but they've not given Russia the kind of support they could have done in that strategic relationship to really piss the Americans off so far that the Americans decide to go overboard on things like tariffs and etc. And actually, I think the Biden administration has pulled its punches on tariffs because it's been eager for the Chinese not to go full hog in terms of backing the Russians. And I think now the Chinese, also with the Trump presidency coming in, I think their desire, I think, would be to get them to end the war and try and show to Trump that they have some leverage over Putin to be able to bring the war to some kind of conclusion. Absolutely. I think the Chinese will be very annoyed that Russia has resorted to a deeper alliance with North Korea and is using North Korean troops in Kursk. Remember, North Korea is China's backyard, right? China thinks it dominates that relationship. And for Russia to muscle in with North Korea and pull North Korea out of China's orbit or strategic orbit, they must be really annoyed by that. That there's no way that China is happy with North Korea's participation in this war directly. So it kind of shows the complications in all this. The Russia, China, US relationship. It's a complicated mix, as I said. China maybe doesn't really particularly care about whether Russia wins. A Russian win, I don't think China would particularly mind. It doesn't want Russia to be defeated, but it doesn't want this war to damage its number one relationship, which is with the Americans, right? And probably they see that they have some leverage. Their ability to rein in Putin gives them a leverage over the Americans with respect to tariffs, right? So it's a complicated relationship. No, it's not panned out in terms of China's support for Russia in the war as people expected.
And of course, the debate around Trump often focuses on, does he support Ukraine? Does he not? Is he a Russian agent? Is he not? It's this sort of stuff. But I think it misses the main point here, which you've hinted at, which is that Trump is coming in and he will have extraordinarily powerful levers to pull, levers which could force Putin to a negotiation which perhaps he doesn't want to engage in, and to make concessions that he certainly doesn't want to make, because it will reduce his status. And standing amongst the Russian elite. If they smell blood in the water, it's a system of sharks. It's not a nice sort of system. But Trump has these incredible levers. You mentioned tariffs on China. Well, if he enacts the worst case scenario on those, surely that would lead to a massive devaluation of the yuan. If Russia has huge currency reserves held in yuan, that's going to have a terrible knock-on effect to Russia's currency reserves. But there are a whole bunch of levers that can be pulled, including perhaps, putting pressure on OPEC to reduce global oil prices. That in itself would starve the Russian system of the revenue it needs. So it seems that Trump actually has a lot more power to support whatever direction his policies may take than we actually realize.
Absolutely. I mean, the Russians continued the war for the last year in the hope of Trump winning the presidential election because they assumed Trump would be soft on Russia, right? They would get a much better deal with Trump. The reality, as you said, Trump has a lot of leverage, right? And actually, he can. I mean, the key for the peace deal is the peace deal has to ensure that Ukraine is sustainable long term, right? Obviously, there's focus on territory, the focus on NATO membership, focus on security guarantees. The Trump team has suggested that maybe the front lines will be frozen. Russia will de facto get to sit on the territory it currently occupies. Uh, well, the rest of Ukraine still occupies 80% of its borders in 91, is absolutely sustainable economically, right? It has a future, has a good future. But the key is security, right? Whatever peace is done, it has to ensure that Russia is not going to invade again. Trump has the leverage there in terms of he can send a strong signal to Putin that the US will continue to arm Ukraine, whether it's paid by the Europeans, whether it's paid by Ukraine, whether frozen Russian assets are used, whatever. But Ukraine will get whatever kit it needs to defend itself. That's a very strong message to Putin. Trump has the ability to do that. Let's just hope that Trump realizes that he has some ace cards, as you mentioned, the commodity oil card, etc. If we see, peace in the Middle East, we see the US pumping more oil. That's going to put downward pressure on oil prices. That will undermine the Russian economy. Again, it will be a factor undermining Putin's position, forcing him in the negotiating table. But I just hope that the Trump team are just not so desperate to get any deal that a terrible deal is imposed on Ukraine that guarantees that Ukraine is going to be not sustainable long term. It's going to be subject to economic, political, and social upheaval, and that would be a huge security threat to Europe, right? So Europe actually has an interest in making sure Trump negotiates in good faith the best deal possible for Ukraine and for Western security. I mean, for Trump, doing a bad deal, would destroy his legacy, right? If it means ultimately the collapse of Ukraine. A collapse of Ukraine in terms of the global consequences, I think will be multiples greater than what happened in Afghanistan. We are talking about the destabilization of the rest of Europe, the whole of Europe. That is globally systemic. A globally systemic event potentially caused because Trump couldn't be bothered to really think through the consequences of whatever peace deal he's likely to try and force on Ukraine, etc.
And we have to say, don't we, that it's Biden's caution, inaction, self-deterrence has also contributed to where we're at the moment. So Trump might cap that with an appalling deal, but Biden's kind of led us to this point, plus the inability of previous US administrations, especially Obama, to give Ukraine any of the weapons it needed, simply even to defend itself, let alone conduct offensive operations. So this is a multi-administration or systemic failure in US policy. Because I know we're going to get a lot of partisan comments. I just want to, beat everybody up to show that we are, looking at this hopefully in a more objective fashion.
Yeah, no, look, I agree. I mean, the Biden administration has not covered itself in glory in Ukraine, right? Neither did the Obama administration. Actually, even the Trump, if you take Obama, Trump, Biden, those three administrations actually failed to arm Ukraine to be able to defend itself. They're all responsible. The Trump administration said, well, we provided javelins. I mean, these are handheld they're hardly game changers. I mean, we should have been providing Ukraine with a full spectrum of conventional military capability to defend itself. I mean, that's the reality. We failed. Trump is now in a position where he has leverage. He really does. Russia is weak. The economy, the ruble is just a reflection of that. Putin actually wants a deal. Trump can ensure Ukraine is sustainable long term by, again, providing those assurances in terms of supply of military kit. That is a win for the US economy, as I mentioned. I mean, it would suggest huge future arms sales, business for US defense companies, and lots of jobs for US workers, right? It's a win-win if Trump plays his cards to their full effect, right? I mean, a deal is absolutely possible. A good deal is possible, but now we'll find out whether Trump is actually the master of the deal, right? He has all the cards. Let's just hope that he is as good as he seems to suggest he is in terms of deal making.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned earlier in this conversation, Putin always escalates to create a better negotiating position. So it's interesting to see how far he is, to use that, awful term, escalating at the moment and deploying terror threats. Well, the very last question here, and this hopefully will tap into some of your historical understanding of economic transition. Putin may want a deal, but it seems his mindset and position may not be to negotiate a reasonable deal. And the Russian way of negotiating, as Keir Giles has pointed out, is usually to come from a very unreasonable standpoint and then stick to your guns throughout the process. So Putin may be moving his system towards something of a systemic collapse simply because of his intransigence and inflexibility, and potentially even now not having accurate information about reality. But something is going on here, something sort of deeper and perhaps more troubling, and that is you've got a economy that moved from a Soviet to a sort of part or hybrid market basis with immense kind of pain and dislocation, but nonetheless managed to achieve that, and indeed life expectancy and etc. prior to 2012, and the proto middle class grew. So there are some positives there historically to look at, but now the reverse is happening. You're going from a partial market economy to more of a nationalized, militarized economy with sort of things like price caps, currency, freezing the currency, falsification. You've got data. It's looking far more Soviet. Are the risks of reversing the process of market liberalization actually ultimately far more risky than the journey Russia's been on through the 90s to the early 2000s?
Well, yeah, I mean, you could argue that uh, the Russian economy was already subject to state capture anyway. I mean, was Gazprom a private entity, or it was just a conduit of Putin's sort of geopolitical ambition, right? I mean, many of those big entities. If you go back to the first Putin term when he reigned in the oligarchs, I mean, any independence they had was kind of gone, and they were agents of the state. I mean, that's the reality. Any big business in Russia was not independent, right? In that, certainly from the second Putin term, I think, and subsequently. And now, we've had, a lot of the foreign businesses nationalized and taken over by Putin's cronies, and move over to a war economy now, right? I mean, which is one of the reasons why it's really important. I mean, it's a really effective war economy, and that's the reality, right? They stepped up munitions production, and countries can do that, right? I mean, Iran, Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war, we've seen ourselves during obviously the Second World War, etc. The real one of the big problems that I think Trump needs to be mindful of is that Ukraine also has a really impressive military-industrial complex now. So if the peace is a bad peace, and Ukraine subsequently collapses, and we see further Russian invasion, and Russia captures Ukraine's military-industrial complex, the combination of Russia's military-industrial complex with Ukraine is a huge threat to Europe. We've seen the inability of Western Europe to produce shells and missiles and all these things, and our failure to get our act in gear. Well, if Russia wins in Ukraine, it will be a European superpower in terms of its military-industrial complex, and a huge future threat to European security. So, I guess we can maybe focus on all the weaknesses in the Russian economy, but the one concern I would have, and then there are certainly systemic risks if a war goes on, and the ruble and all these kind of things. But this is now a very effective military industrial machine, right? I mean, they sacrificed, the market economy, all these things to make an economy that rejuvenates the military capability, right? It's a huge threat. We have to make sure the peace in Ukraine is a good peace that secures Ukraine and secures Europe, right? So I'd probably end on that note.
That's a very important insight, and I think there's a lot of ideas to unpack there which don't get too much of an airing, it has to be said, in the mainstream media. Tim, it's been absolutely brilliant having you back on. I know the audience are going to appreciate some of the insights and discussions here, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to discuss this as well. Thank you for coming back on the channel.
My pleasure. Thank you. Very good.